Princess Mononoke is one of Studio Ghibli's highest praised films, and for good reason. Directed by the legendary Hayao Miyazaki, the tale is an epic in every sense of the word, but the centerpiece of it all is the enigmatic San, who is very in touch with nature and bears a strong resentment for humans, which I guess makes sense if you've been raised by wolves your whole life. So being raised by wolves, it seems only natural that she'd want to dress herself in the same fashion as her adopted canine cohorts. That is to say, draped in fur both to keep warm and to hide her human characteristics, which over time she's grown to dislike. But where exactly did San get that fur in the first place? Other than the wolves in the film, the glorious white fur San wears seems to be in short supply. This has made people wonder, is San wearing the fur of a deceased white wolf that was once her sibling? First off, it's worth noting that this film has already had some pretty convincing theories in the past. One of the most discussed until recently was whether the film contained themes regarding physical health, and that the incurable disease that the factory workers had was in fact leprosy. And earlier this year, Miyazaki himself confirmed that theory to be true around the time of World Leprosy Day on January 31st. We're not going to spend any more time on that, but as you can see, this movie already has a pretty good track record when it comes to fan theories. So where are we getting this idea from? Why would we immediately jump to thinking that San is wearing the carcass of a dead wolf rather than, I don't know, literally any other option? In the film, San's backstory as to how she came to be raised by the wolf goddess Moro is revealed to us. Apparently, her original parents were attacked by Moro as they were found violating her forest. Her parents, in a panic, then offered Moro their daughter San as a tribute. The film's wording, however, of how exactly San's parents were defiling the forest is incredibly vague at best. In fact, it's pretty much all we're given, so that means that San's parents could have been doing almost anything. Now, it's undeniable that Moro dislikes humans in general, so with that in mind, why make any particular example out of San's parents? And why even bother to raise San herself rather than just, killing her? But when people's imaginations run wild, some twisted stuff is bound to surface. And that's exactly what happened. Some people have proposed that the answers to all of these questions is that Moro originally had 3 wolf cubs as opposed to the 2 that we see in the film. And that San's parents killed one of them for reasons, which is obviously the most thought out and best reason, which then led to Moro attacking them, which then led to the tribute, which then led to Moro raising San as one of her children. This may seem like a pretty spectacular leap in logic with not that much to support it, but there actually is one big piece of supporting evidence. And that's San's name itself, which means 3 in Japanese. It looks like it supports the theory that when Moro was naming San, she saw her as nothing more than a replacement for her fallen pup. That's not to say that the 3rd baby wolf was just left behind, though. The theory goes on to state that the white fur San wears is actually that same cub her parents killed 17 years ago. But how can we be sure she's actually wearing wolf fur? How can we be sure that she isn't wearing the fur of some other animal that she or Moro may have killed in the past? Well, as we've already established, white fur is incredibly hard to find in the area that Princess Mononoke is set in, since the only other animals with pale white fur that we see in the entire film are the wolves. However, just because the wolves are the only white-furred mammals we see throughout the film doesn't necessarily rule out every other animal outright. If San sees herself as a wolf, she would want to do everything to look like one, right? So is it possible she could have dyed or bleached the fur of another animal for the sake of color coordination or solidarity with her family? While she technically could have, it would have been an incredibly long process, even over the course of San's 17 years. Barring the existence of some nearby spring that had just the right balance of chemicals for achieving pure white fur, one of the only natural resources that would be available for the use of lightening fur would be the sun, as it has a tendency to wash out the color of certain materials over time, including human hair, among other things. But seeing as not every wild animal in the world is white, it becomes difficult to assume that the sun is having any effect on the fur that San wears. It also becomes difficult to assume that she's personally affecting the color of her fur at all. Even if she did, maintaining that perfect white color and making sure it doesn't go a bit gray or yellow or green would be way more trouble than it's worth, even if you do want to feel that kind of solidarity with your wolf family. However, ruling out these options and seeing as San's fur does maintain that shade of white, it makes sense to assume that she is absolutely wearing the fur of the wolves. Unfortunately, it's making a pretty good case that throughout this movie, San's been carrying a dead wolf pup on her back. Is there anything we can take a look at that might provide us with a bit more information on the matter? first let's discuss the wolves in the film and how they would act given certain circumstances. Keep in mind, while Moro is a goddess, she and her clan are still wolves, so we're gonna take a look at them from that perspective. But of course, since there is a spiritual, fantastical element to this whole film, feel free to take as much or as little as you want from this explanation. So one of my first big questions when I heard this theory was, how do wolves treat members of their pack when they die? As it turns out, they've been known to address deaths within the pack very much like humans. When an alpha of the pack dies, wolves are liable to go through an extended period of mourning, which has in past cases led to the complete dissolution of the pack. However, when wolf cubs die, while still tragic, it's a bit more expected since life in the wilderness can be pretty rough. Some wolves have displayed tendencies of burying their young using things like sticks and leaves, while other reports have shown that wolves will just leave their young where they fall. But regardless of what they do with the body, it's well documented that wolves grieve their dead, which gives us reasonable precedence to the basis of this theory. Based on this, it's totally likely that Moro would have taken San in as a replacement for her fallen young. However, this doesn't really confirm or deny our theory, it just moves it. If this is true, that means Moro probably carried around this dead wolf for a number of years, while San was, you know, a baby who couldn't fashion her stylish furs at the time. And wolves are a pretty nomadic species, meaning they probably wouldn't just leave the body somewhere. They'd have to bring it with them unless it was exceptionally well hidden. And while wolves, like humans, grieve, I don't think there's many humans out there who develop unhealthy obsessions with keeping the dead bodies of their loved ones. Let's not dwell on that last point too much. But we did just say that Moro could have hidden the pup and then later given San the fur when she was either older or experienced enough to fashion her clothing. It would be quite the long play for Moro, but it's no more or less likely than anything else given the vague nature of this theory. Next, let's take a closer look at the actual nature of San's fur. So far, we've established pretty firmly that it's unlikely she's wearing anything other than the fur of the white wolves. But just because she's wearing wolf fur doesn't necessarily mean that she's wearing the fur of a dead wolf. While using the pelt of a deceased wolf would certainly be the easiest way to develop her attire, there are other ways San could have constructed her trademark clothing. One thing you might have noticed is that because of the style of the animation, whenever you see her furs, you can't actually see any evidence of a wolf pelt or hide being used. We just see a big, flowy, relatively shapeless fur thing. And while this is a small detail, Princess Mononoke doesn't take place in Siberia. It takes place in Japan during what appears to be spring or summer. Wearing a wolf pelt on your back would be adding quite a bit of unnecessary weight, something that an experienced fighter and survivalist like San probably wouldn't want or need. So what do I mean when I say that white wolf fur doesn't need to mean a dead wolf? It's actually a pretty simple solution. Wolves, as with most furry mammals, shed a considerable amount of their fur in the spring. So it may be possible that San is actually using the shed fur of the wolves she lives with to fashion her clothing. Now, this is by no means a simple or quick undertaking, but in San's case, she's had around 17 years to hone her craftsmanship and collect fur, so if anyone's capable, it's her. So how could she have made this out of loose fur? One method she could have possibly used was by collecting a bunch of fur and then employing a craft like felting, which is the practice of pressing or condensing certain fibers together to form a more solid base. While it's true that wool is more closely associated with felting, other animal fibers have shown to be just as effective in certain felting techniques. From there, all San would need to do is add fur to the felt base she created through similar methods. Alternatively, San could have created a base by weaving together some other sort of natural cordage. In other words, she could have used rope or twine created from natural sources. This kind of twine is usually used for things like bowstrings, fishing lines, or other essential survival equipment, which is something you probably would have picked up on if you grew up in the wilderness. And seeing as she's someone who did that, San should have quite a bit of experience with it. By weaving together this kind of cordage, it would create a substantially more lightweight base for San to attach more fur to, which she could do by using more twine to attach the fur to the base itself. Again, these methods aren't the most elegant or efficient solutions, but consider this. Moro may have raised San as one of her children, but San was always still a human in Moro's eyes. If San's parents did indeed kill a wolf pup, which Moro considered to be desecrating her woods, why would she then let San piggyback off her parents' misdeeds? Granted, it would make for some pretty interesting symbolism, since San would always live in the shadow of her parents' sins, and then that would add to the tension between her and her adoptive mother. But in the film's established universe, this this theory doesn't seem to hold a lot of water in a practical sense. In the end, it would make more sense for San to use methods that don't hurt anyone in the long run, like the coats her family would shed every spring. As for the significance of San's name, there actually is a reason she has that name, but it was really only apparent in the early stages of the movie's development. In the original concept, Princess Mononoke contained a kingdom with 3 princesses, and in the story, the 3rd princess was sent off to marry a beast. Unsurprisingly, this beast was a Mononoke. But since the original concept, the movie's story obviously changed quite significantly, but San's name stuck. As for the movie's in-universe explanation, while it can be used for supporting evidence of this theory, it can just as easily mean that Moro couldn't be bothered to come up with a name for a human. Or a 3rd child. Which, to be fair, is probably the naming convention I'd use for my kids. So after this examination, does it still make sense to say that San's furs are the remains of one of her siblings? Personally, I would rate the plausibility of this conspiracy 2 Kodama out of 5. But that's just me. What do you think? Do you think San's furs could be the remains of a dead white wolf? And what's your favorite Studio Ghibli film? Be sure to sound off in the comments below, and feel free to send us any conspiracy ideas you'd like us to take a look at in the future. Until then, if you're new here, be sure to like this video and subscribe to ChannelFrederator for more cartoon conspiracies.